All right, last one. We're getting into the spinal cord. So this one we got to talk about because we are going to be getting into reflexes and the reflex arc. So we're going to talk about the spinal nerves that come from the spinal cord, talk about gray matter and white matter in the spinal cord, and then different tracts that we see along the spinal cord. We'll talk about the reflex arc, different reflex arcs, and different reflex signs that we see, and then how traumatic injury to the spinal cord can impact someone as well as ALS. All right, so the spinal cord, remember we are going from that brainstem, moving down, it's continuous with that from the medulla oblongata. And we're gonna run down the spine all the way down to about the L1, L2 area. So we look at where it ends. Whoa, it ends all the way up here, right? The spinal cord does not, the spinal cord itself does not go all the way down the entire vertebral column. Actually, what we have right at that L2 level is the nerves are going to continue down. So the nerves continue down and then exit out at their appropriate level. So we see 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out. Some are going to be sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are going to be involved. So sensory neurons are going to enter at the dorsal root. So they're going to enter at the root at the back of the spinal cord. And motor neurons are going to exit via the ventral root, or the front of the spinal cord. So dorsal root's going to be more towards the back. Ventral root's going to be closer towards the innards, right? The guts right here. And we have gray and white matter, just like the brain, same description. However, we see that the gray matter is generally in the inside and white matter is going to be held on the outside. So we're kind of reverse of the brain in terms of where we find white versus gray matter. So here's our spinal nerve. This is part of, again, our peripheral nervous system. So we have to kind of talk about the link here. We can't really talk about the spinal cord without talking about nerves, which is why we're kind of linking both central and peripheral together in this video. But if we look at how information passes, right, afferent sensory information comes in. This is at the back, the dorsal root, right? So here we don't see it, but these two things would connect together into the spinal nerve. We split, right? And here we bring in sensory information through the dorsal root, right? We can then process it, send it up to the brain, whatever we need to do. And then if the motor output's coming down, we're going to send that out through the ventral root, right, out the front. And then again, these two join up to form the entire spinal nerve. Right, that little bulge we see here is the dorsal root ganglion. That's where we find lots of cell bodies. See, here's that little cell body, right? Boom, right there. So we see a bunch of those guys, right, collected together. And then here, if you look at this, the shape, this looks like a unipolar neuron, right? Over here, we see the somatic. So we see here's the cell body and whatnot. They're found within that gray matter in the spinal cord. And we see it has the shape of a multipolar neuron. So we actually have some hints in the picture here that maybe you noticed, but maybe you didn't. And if you didn't, now you did, and hopefully that helps. So the gray matter, again, is just going to be where we have like cell bodies, neuroglia, dendrites, and then unmyelinated axons. This is going to be for processing, and the white matter is going to be where we find the myelinated axons for transmission speed. So again, the gray matter, just like the gray matter in the brain, we are going to receive, integrate, and send out signals. This also includes the spinal reflexes, where we are not sending that information to the brain. We are processing it and sending out an output directly from the spinal cord. Right. White matter, though, we find the axons. These are myelinated, which is why they are white, and they are found in tracts. Sorry, there's a spelling there, tracts with a T, and they are going to basically move, the tracts are going to run vertically, so down through the spinal cord and up through towards the brain. We have a couple different columns. Right, so here are our columns. We have the lateral corticospinal tract, that's going to be for motor, the ventral corticospinal tract for motor, and then on the blue side we see dorsal columns for touch, proprioception, vibration, the lateral spinothalamic, which is for pain and temperature, and then ventral spinal thalamic, that's for light touch. And this is again for sensory information, right? So information, and you notice everything for sensory, we're talking somatosensory, right? Touch, vibration, temperature, pain, right? Things of that nature. It's all somatosensory because your special senses, generally like taste, smell, vision, those are all going directly to the brain. The spinal cord doesn't need to worry about that. So let's talk about some ascending tracts. So you notice that we have spino in the front. And these are, if we look at, we have 1, 2, 3 neurons. So these tracts are going to go from the cerebral cortex, right? Like from the receptor, from whatever is detecting the change, up through the spinal cord, up to the cerebral cortex. And again, there are 3 neurons. The first one, the afferent neuron, this is the sensory one, right? This is the one that has the receptors that are detecting pain or detecting temperature, or detecting pressure or whatever. We notice they come in, they go through the dorsal root, right? There's our, see the shape? Through the back there, through the dorsal root, through the dorsal horn. The second one is going to join up in that gray matter in the spinal cord, right? And is going to pass up through the spinal cord up until we get to the thalamus. And then from there, we see the last one, which is going to bridge us from the thalamus to, in this case, the somatosensory cortex, right? But it's 3 neurons. So this could be coming from like the foot. Let's say this is a thermoreceptor in the bottom of your foot, right? How hot is the ground that you're walking on? Running up your leg, up towards your, towards your spinal cord, right? So that's pretty long, right? That has to run the entire length of your leg if it's a thermoreceptor on the bottom of your foot. Then you have the second one running from kind of like the bottom of your spinal cord up the entire length of your back and neck, right? All the way up to kind of towards like the middle of your head. And then the last one just has to go from the middle of your brain towards the edge, right? But think about how long those are. Each one is, most of these are going to be a couple feet, right, in length, which is pretty impressive. But just knowing those 3, right, we have those 3, right, you could, draw this out, something along those lines. All right, the second type, right, this is where we only have 2. So this is when we are terminating at the cerebellum. So the sensory neurons are still entering in. So this is from like your joints, your muscles, your tendons. So this is for more of like your positioning, right? So they come in again through that dorsal root because it's sensory. We then link up with the second neuron, which is then going to go up through the spinal cord, up through the medulla oblongata, and then through the pons, and then from the pons pass to the cerebellum, right? And again, so that's so we can collect information on our positioning. Where are our limbs? How are they positioned, right? How do we need to make adjustments to keep things like balance? The descending tracts, this is for motor control because they're going down from the brain towards the effector, towards the part of the body we need to like do something. And so we see that the suffix is spinal, so like corticospinal. And then where they come from. So like from the cortex down to the spine, so corticospinal. And you think about it, makes sense because we're starting from the cortex and then making our way down the spinal column, right down through the spinal cord. So like the pyramidal or the corticospinal, this is where we originate from the cortex, where we're making voluntary movements. And we have 2 neurons, one that's going to run from the cortex all the way down the entire spinal cord. So it's running from the brain all the way down through the midbrain, through the pons, through the medulla, down through the spinal cord. And if you notice, we have that pyramidal decussation. We started, right? If we're let's say we're looking at this person, face to face, this would be their right, right? We're going down the right side, right, and then before we leave, we at this, down at the pyramidal, decussation, we move over to the left. Then we continue down the spinal cord and then connect there. And so this is why we see that like contralateral control, why like the left is controlled by the right and the right is controlled by the left. It's because when we do this output, right, for like the limbs and whatnot, this pyramidal decussation, that like location right here, we move over, right? So it's interesting, right? It's an interesting, and then we can move out through the motor neuron, right, which will then move, pass down to whatever body part needs to be controlled, right? Arm, leg, whatever. So, right, we also have the extrapyramidal. This is where we're originating in the midbrain, the pons, medulla. So this is unconscious movement. This is some subconscious. You don't actively think about this. Same thing, 2 neurons. We do still see that passing over, right, from, in this case, so it happens very quickly, right, from right to left, right? It passes down through the spinal cord and then out. Now what happens if we get an injury, like traumatic spinal cord injury? So keep in mind, before we get into like what happens here, plasticity and versus repair. Remember what early on in this unit we talked about how the central nervous system neurons do not have that like powerful regenerative ability. We see that in the peripheral nervous system, but we don't see that in the central. And so a traumatic spinal cord injury does not repair the same way a peripheral nerve injury could. There is plasticity, right? Yes, so some things may be regained, but this is why someone can be like paralyzed and they're paralyzed for life, because we don't have that regeneration. We don't have that repair that the peripheral nervous system has. The spinal cord, since it's central, relies on plasticity only. So the outcome of a traumatic spinal cord injury really depends on how traumatic or how damaged the spinal cord is, or where the compression's at, and also where along the spinal cord did this occur. So let's say we completely transect, we have severed the spinal cord, there will be complete paralysis. There'll be loss of communication with everything from that point down. A partial transection can lead to varying levels of paralysis. So, maybe we have weakness or numbness, but we can still move it a little bit. Or maybe we just, it can vary, right? It really just varies on how much damage was done. And again, it also matters where. So something that happens like all the way up in the neck can result in paralysis in all of the limbs, in arms and legs, whereas something that's further down may only lead to problems with the legs, right? And the arms are totally fine. So it depends on, where that injury occurs to which level. Usually the first thing that happens after the injury is you get swelling, and this can actually make it worse a little bit. And so things like corticosteroids can be given to reduce that swelling, because it's going to help fight inflammation and whatnot to remove that worsening of the injury. It doesn't fix the injury, but it can take away the things that make it worse over time. And then amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, also called Lou Gehrig's disease. This is a very severe neurodegenerative disease or disorder of the brain. This leads to the degeneration of motor neurons. And so this will cause skeletal muscles to weaken. The person, right, we don't exactly know what causes it. We don't exactly know what, we don't really have a way to fix this, and we definitely don't have a cure. But the motor neurons do die, and so the muscles that are serviced by those motor neurons can no longer communicate with the spinal cord, can no longer communicate with the brain, and so those muscles are no longer able to be used. So this leads to muscle weakness. They have trouble coordinating, their muscles may be stiff, they lose muscle because they're not using it, so their muscles atrophy. It can lead to spasms or reflexes just going off. they have problems with more complicated actions like walking, talking, eating. Usually there's medications like glutamate antagonists, physical therapy that can help. But this is something that will continue to get worse. It can vary from person to person in terms of how long or how fast it progresses, although usually it's just a few years before the person passes away from this. And usually, not always, but usually the cause of death for someone with ALS is respiratory failure. And this is because the motor neurons that communicate with the diaphragm, those motor neurons die. And so that person's diaphragm no longer will function, or it can also, the motor neurons to some of the intercostal muscles also can die, but usually we're thinking diaphragm. Their diaphragm can no longer function, and so they can no longer breathe. And so that's usually the thing that takes ALS patients in the end, is the motor neurons that communicate with the diaphragm do not work anymore. The diaphragm can no longer be controlled, and so the person's breathing can no longer be controlled either, and so they go into respiratory failure. Something a little bit lighter, I know that was a little heavy, is the spinal cord reflex. The reflex is going to be where the spinal cord does the integrating rather than the brain. So we bypass the brain completely. This is very fast, it's very predictable, you don't think about it, it's an automatic response, right? And this is to help us maintain homeostasis. They can be spinal or cranial, they can be somatic or autonomic. We're going to talk about kind of all of them, but before we get into different types of reflexes, let's talk about the generic reflex arc, because they all have the same basic steps, right? One is a sensory receptor detects a change, right? So in this case, we see that there's a tack, ouch, right? A tack has been pushed into the skin. And so those free nerve endings detect the pain. Our sensory neuron carries that impulse to the spinal cord. The interneuron is going to then process that, and then the motor neuron carries a response. In this case, because of the pinprick, the response is going to be to pull, to pull the foot up. Let's say we stepped on it, to pull the foot up so that we can remove the pressure of pushing that pin further in. The motor neuron sends us to the muscles, like in this case in the foot, and then those muscles contract to lift your foot up off the ground. So they have all these basic things: the receptor, the sensory neuron, the integrating happening in the central nervous system, then the motor neuron carrying a signal out, the effector then causing an effect. And these happen fast, right? You don't think about it, you don't have to do anything, and it's the same action every single time. So if you were to step on a tack or a nail, right, you're gonna have the same action every time. You step on it, you immediately pull your foot up off, so you're relieving the pressure that was pushing that tack into the skin. So it's the same action every time, and it happens rapid fire. And we can use reflex testing to diagnose disorders. So like the patellar reflex, this is where, they hit right below your kneecap, right on the patellar tendon to see the leg kick up, right? The Achilles reflex, we do the same kind of thing, but on the Achilles tendon. The Babinski reflex, which is kind of seeing the flexing of the foot, the dorsiflexion of the foot. If you were to run a finger along the bottom of the foot, and we look at this in babies. The abdominal reflex and the pupillary reflex, right? We'll be looking at the patellar reflex as well as the pupillary reflex a little bit in lab. So the autonomic nervous system reflex arcs, this is where we're looking at innervation of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands. So for example, like the pupillary reflex, this is looking at how your pupil changes shape in response to light, in changes in light. And so that controls the smooth muscle and whatnot that surrounds your pupil, right? Somatic spinal reflexes, this is involving skeletal muscles. So this would be like the patellar reflex, which is the one we'll be doing in class in lab. So the Babinski reflex, this is the extensor plantar response. So we see dorsiflexion, right, of the foot during this one. We do this in babies, right? So normally there's an upward movement of the big toe, and then the toes kind of fan out, right? So that kind of moves the foot up and the toes kind of spread apart. When we move something along the foot, so we just something light, you know, we're not trying to hurt them. We're just moving something from the heel up towards the feet, up towards the toes, and we get this movement of the foot kind of up and the toes kind of spread out, right? And so this is just the reflex contraction of the extensor muscles in the toes. Once the central nervous system develops more, right after around age 2, we don't necessarily get this same reflex. This same stimulation, right? We see the toes curl down, right? They curl inward. So we can use this to determine if someone's nervous system is functioning correctly. What we see is like if someone has damage to the central nervous system, we see the Babinski reflex, the one that we would normally see in the baby, we see in an adult. So, you know, the same motion, right, in the baby, we see the toes move up and fan out, but in an adult, they should curl down and in. If the adult has the same response as a baby, then we know something went wrong. Maybe there's an injury to their spinal cord. Maybe they have something like MS, a brain tumor, ALS. It doesn't tell us exactly what, but it tells us that there may be a problem with the central nervous system. The stretch reflex. So this is where we basically we have like the muscles get stretched a bit more. This is ipsilateral, meaning controlled on the same side, right? Versus contralateral, which was opposite side. This is super important for maintaining muscle tone and coordination. We have a negative feedback mechanism in place to make sure that the muscle doesn't overstretch, right? So we cause muscle contraction to prevent the muscle from overstretching, right? So if we look at what's happening, right? Here is the increased tension, right? So tension, like we have stretched this tendon more than we should. And so there are sensory receptors in that tendon that detect that extra stretch. We send a signal along the sensory neuron. It's excited because, hey, we went too far. We then make our way up right into the gray matter in the spinal cord. Our interneurons process that, and we have two signals being sent. We have an inhibitory and an excitatory. So we integrate, we go, okay, we have stretched this particular muscle. And so we have inhibitory, right, being sent out along here. We're inhibiting this motor neuron. And we have a positive one being sent out here. So we see that we are going to be exciting these muscles, causing contraction, right? Whereas this one's being inhibited. And the reason why we send out two, right? Because think about these two muscles, right? Or these two muscle groups, right? They perform opposite action. If these muscles contract, the muscles up here have to relax because they work opposite of each other. If they were both to contract, right? Both are contracting, we're going to have pain, we're going to have a problem. They have to be opposite. So we're sending out the two different signals, the inhibitory and the excitatory, because we want one of these muscle groups to contract, but because of this one's contracting, we have to force the other one to relax. We cannot allow the other one to contract at the same time, right? So that's all I'm worried about here, is just understanding, like, why are we sending out both inhibitory and excitatory signals? That is why. Right? We don't want both muscle groups contracting at the exact same time. We need to force the opposite one to relax so that one can contract. Right, so the tendon reflex, this is, again, kind of similar. It's, again, ipsilateral. We are causing muscle tension because we're hitting on that tendon, right? And so this is the one we're going to be looking at in lab, specifically this particular patellar tendon reflex. And so we see that we have stretched the muscle by pushing on that, right? By hitting that tendon. So the sensory receptors in the muscles detect that they have been stretched. We send an excitatory signal out, right? We process that, and again, we see an excitatory and an inhibitory. And in this case, right, we kick the leg out, right? When we hit this particular tendon, we're going to cause the muscles on the front side of the thigh to contract. And because the front side of the thigh muscles are contracting, the ones in the back of the thigh need to relax, because again, they're antagonistic to each other. We can't have both groups contract. And so when the ones in the front of the thigh contract, we have the inhibitory signal sent out to force the ones in the back of the thigh to relax, and that allows that kicking out motion. Right, so this is the one we're going to do. You should be able to kind of tell me what's going on here. You should be able to look at this picture and be able to tell me this is what's going on and this is why. Why do we have the inhibitory and excitatory? It's the same concept, right, as the one before, right? This is just a little bit different in terms of, why or what's happening specifically, but the same concept of we have one muscle group that's contracting, the one that's antagonistic has to relax. Otherwise, if everyone's contracting together, it's going to be painful, right? And it could cause damage. Then we get to the crossed extensor reflex. This is contralateral, meaning it crosses over. So left, if whatever's being processed, whatever's happening on the right gets processed on the left. This is for balance maintaining. And so this helps synchronize the extension of joints in one limb and flexion in the opposite, right? So we see as we withdraw the right leg, we extend the left, right? That's what's helping us here. Right? And you can pause. I know I've been going on for a while, so you can pause here and take a peek at this. But in general, we still, kind of see some of the similar aspects with that reflex. This case, though, because we're using two different limbs, we don't necessarily see the inhibitory signals being sent. We just see that the excitatory signals are being sent to the opposite muscle groups, but they're in different legs, right? So we don't have that that double, contraction happening in the same leg. The opposite muscle groups are being excited in opposite legs. And then the flexor reflex, this is withdrawal. This is ipsilateral. This is a protective reflex. So if you were to, step on a tack or touch something hot, right? Something like that. Basically, whatever you just came into contact with can cause damage, right? It's causing pain, and if it's causing pain, that means it can probably cause damage. We excite the sensory neuron, right? We process that in the spinal cord, and then we send out send out signals to the effectors that cause you to pull that limb, pull that body part away, right? And again, that's to limit the damage. So let's say we did this with touching a hot stove, right? We touch the hot stove, we receive information that this is hot and is causing pain, and then we send out the signal to the spinal cord through the sensory neurons, interneurons in the spinal cord process that. We send out signals to the effectors in the arm to pull the hand away. And again, that's because when we sense that pain, with pain usually comes damage, right? Tissue damage. The faster we can pull that hand away, the less damage we incur, right? So it's protective. And that's why we do this in the spinal cord, right, in this case, because even a small delay, right, going up to the brain can cause much more damage. The faster we do it, right, and the faster these signals can be sent and processed and dealt with, the less damage we incur.